self-isolating. The lead story on the Examiner, though, is a different story. You may have heard this last night. It's a breaking news. Up to 500 Aer Lingus jobs at risk. The airline's review could threaten Cork and Shannon airports' future. The viability of Cork and Shannon under threat as Aer Lingus carries out a review of its operations, which could put hundreds of jobs at risk. And for more on this story, I am joined on the line by Eoghan Corry, travel journalist, author and broadcaster. Eoghan, good morning to you. Thanks for being with us.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Eoghan, this is very worrying news indeed. We knew the airline's profits had taken a big hit because of coronavirus. That was obvious, but is this worse than people may have feared?
It's actually the opposite. It's quite a little bit better than what we've been seeing internationally across the aviation industry. You could take the figure of about 1/5 or 1/6 of employees being made redundant by airlines right across Europe. It's not just a blow to profits, it's a serious loss-making situation. Some airlines digging down for about 4 years of losses. Aer Lingus's position from the beginning was, and they've about 4,500 employees. It goes up and down a little bit seasonally, so summer 2019 can't be compared with summer 2020, was that they were going to seek redundancies. They would hope to get them voluntarily. A figure of 900 was probably leaked or placed. It was never confirmed by Aer Lingus. So talking about 500, maybe 600, and saying that they could maybe be compulsory redundancies in that is the sort of language that is a lot better than what we were hearing in March, and is also, this is really important, when you're dealing with the number of unions, trade unions that Aer Lingus deal with, that you put positions out which may not be the final position.
Yeah, because yet the company would say in their statement that they're lagging behind other airlines because of the fact that we have had quite, stringent restrictions around travel, and they would say, that's the government's fault.
Absolutely. Aer Lingus has been disproportionately punished by this crazy situation. Listeners will need no introduction to the fact we waited for so long for a list of approved countries, and when it came, flights were approved from 15 countries, 4 of which didn't have direct flights to Ireland and 2 of which didn't have airports. So it's quite clear that the so-called green list, which has now been gone into history, was clearly an attempt not to try and curtail as much travel as possible. And the flights had resumed from about July the 1st. From the very beginning, Ryanair had been much more feisty in the number of flights they put in the air. We saw Aer Lingus cancelling a lot of the flights right through to August, and after the publication of the Green List, cancelling a few more. So they've been disproportionately hit. The figures that came out from the IAG this week were that the revenue was down to about 1/3 over the last 6 months than it had been. Sounds bad, but it's not bad by international standards. And one of the reasons is that over the years, Aer Lingus has been working itself into a position with one of the lower cost bases in Europe. The reason clearly is that they had to compete against Ryanair, but it means within the IAG group their unit costs are lower. So when the storm comes and the storm is blowing around everybody's ears at the moment, IAG would have something like 84,000 employees. They're looking for 12,000 redundancies and maybe more out of that. Aer Lingus might be faring a little bit better than others in the group. Still not ideal in that all their operations would come under examination, including those regional airports.
Yeah, so it's saying it's going to have to determine if it can afford basically to keep Shannon and Cork running. If they were to close those bases, that would be a massive blow to the Midwest.
It's a big problem because Aer Lingus's operating costs, and not so much in Cork but in Shannon, have always been over the top. It's due to the legacy agreements. The staffing of afternoon flights was always a little bit high. That wouldn't be a problem if everybody was still doing flag carrying as we did in the 70s with British Airways, Air France, KLM. But once Ryanair arrived on the scene, it exposed the problems of having a higher cost base. They've never quite grappled with that, and Shannon is particularly a problem for Aer Lingus. There are like every airline has places that they just can't make money. Qantas has a load of them as well, but Shannon is a historic problem for Aer Lingus. Even in the good times, they had problems there, and Shannon's numbers declined by 7% in 2019. So Shannon, even in the good times, was a problem. Cork, for instance, to give an example of the scale of things that's going through at the moment, we'll have have 80 flights out of Dublin today, about 12 or 13 out of Cork and 6 out of Shannon, all Ryanair. So that shows you what's going on in regional airports during the current crisis. And I think Cork, for instance, Aer Lingus maintained Shannon Heathrow and Cork Heathrow through the crisis, but had dropped Shannon Heathrow because there were no passengers on it. There were at least half a dozen or 10 passengers on the Cork one. And there's another important factor for the lifetime of this government, such as it is. 3 cabinet ministers have the Cork airport in their constituency.
Just to end on that, like, one of the criticisms from the company is this lack of sort of having no line of sight of where things are going. This has also been a criticism of the government from, say, the publicans. There is this message of, we just need to know what's going to happen. If you could just tell us what's going to happen, then we can manage our expectations. Is this news going to put the government under more pressure to try and kind of come up with a better plan in terms of travel?
I wouldn't confuse the publicans and the travel thing in any sense. What we got from travel from May the 27th was a clear plan at European level with the European Centre of Disease Control. They went to the airlines. It took them about 2 weeks to put the standards in place, a safe opening of borders. It was all managed clearly with people's health in mind, and also, taking cognizance of the fact that this, you wouldn't think it by some of the Twitter storm, but travel is not responsible for a large number of cases. 1.6% of all infections in Ireland are travel related. Now, when it came to the Irish government to implement those, they didn't actually say yes, they didn't say no, they just let it roll on. And what they seem to be saying is, we're happy to have the airlines flying, but we're determined not to have any passengers on those aircraft. That'll lead to the commercial decisions that Aer Lingus are threatening about Heathrow and Cork. And the problem is the time lag here. While the government might think, oh yeah, we'll stop all the people leaving, well, they're not doing so, because 13,000 people a day are going to the airport. The regulations are being clearly ignored, not because they're bad, but because they make no sense. There is no coherent alternative. And the commercial decisions that are being made will affect future. It'll affect the winter and it'll affect the summer of 2021. We could end up from going from one of the most connected islands in the world at the beginning of March 2020 to having virtually no connections in 2021. That's a little bit of scaremongering by the airlines. They did a little bit of in the Oireachtas committee this week. We're not at that point yet, but we certainly need the government to sit back and say, this is how we're going to manage the opening of the borders. And let's not get diverted by the NFET agenda, which is to try and curtail travel completely, because it just the economic costs to the island are so enormous for doing that. We're not an island with a big local trade. We need to trade with the rest of the world. All our industry is multinational. Everything we produce is exported, and there are machines. I mean, it's not just bucket and spade in Spain we're talking about. There are machines waiting to be serviced. The length and breadth of this country, engineers can't come in to service them because the Irish government policy says maybe you can come in, but you won't be insured when you do so. We need a serious rethink on that.
Okay, travel journalist Eoghan Corry, thank you. Lots of food for thought there. Thanks for being with us.
Always a pleasure.
On Newstalk Breakfast this morning. Now,